From Dame Marina Warner back to LMH for an in-conversation. Marina is many things. Most importantly to us, Marina is an alumna of LMH, matriculated in 1964. You're also an honorary fellow of LMH and also an LMH parent. So you have the trifecta of LMH connections. So it's great to have you back to speak. Thank you so much for coming. Obviously, Marina's had a long career as an author, novelist, writer. You're also now a companion of honor, which I'd love to talk about a little bit, what the parties are like with Elton John and Paul McCartney and David Attenborough in the Companions of Honor, which is good. But I just want to start with how your time at LMH. You did say when you got to Oxford, and the sense of decorum was oppressive. And I think you also said if you're interested in clothes, you are considered not to be interested in academics.
Yes.
So how was your time here?
Well, first of all, I must say that I was extremely delighted to get into Oxford. And that really felt like a tremendous achievement. My school had not sent anybody. I had to do the entrance exams from a crammers, and I really thought I had very little chance. So it was a huge joy and real source of pride. And in those days, it was harder for girls, you know. So, I mean, I'm really pleased that this achievement has happened, that now there's almost equal parity for women to go to university. It's one of the great changes in our society that this has happened, because, in fact, my father was rather unusual in his encouragement. So when I got to LMH, well, first of all, one of the amazing things is that some of the old pioneers were still alive. So we used to see one of them, Mrs. Denicky, in the garden, going for a walk. And this extraordinary sense of the past when they had fought so valiantly to get women into universities and then, you know, getting allowed to be taken degrees. So I like that very much about LMH. And of course, it's a beautiful place. That was a great source of inspiration. But I did find Oxford. I was hesitant about talking about this, you know, with you, because I did find Oxford very difficult. And I think it has changed for the better, amazingly, particularly with regard to women. I mean, there was a way in that remark about if you're interested in clothes, you could be considered sort of no good intellectually. That was part of the general contempt. There was a lot of contempt for us women. We had to struggle quite hard to be thought of, taken seriously. We were known as undergraduates, you know, which is not very complimentary, really. Yeah,
I did delve onto your website, so I know that, and did find to that degree a cutting from 1964 about rather the smartest of the smart girls in London, featuring an 18-year-old Marina Warner from Oxford. And started, at Oxford, she is at all the best undergraduate parties. So,
I don't think this newspaper has changed much in its character. I think it's still peddling a lot of nonsense. I mean, it's true that there was a kind of ethos. There was a kind of hooray ethos. And there were a lot of hooray parties of one kind or another. I mean, and in my first term, I remember being sort of terribly embarrassed because a whole lot of young men turned up at my door whom I didn't know, who were running beagles. I think, and in my memory, the beagles were even in the garden. And they wanted me to go beagling with them. And this is just because they would look up, I think, who had come from, I came from a sort of private school. So they probably, you know, they were looking up who could be approached. Anyway, I tried to distance myself from that world.
So I
did glimpse it. I did go to some of these drinking parties and things. So I did glimpse it. But I did think I did want to change, and I began doing other things.
Your contemporary from LMH, Diana Quick, wrote about your time, said you were the smartest person, because we have a university challenge, an attempt at the University Challenge team at LMH, which is trying to get back onto University Challenge. I know you weren't on University Challenge, but I believe you were on...
I don't think it came when I was here
Yeah.
to us. I don't think it came round.
But I do believe you're on Double Your Money. Is that
Yes,
correct? So
yes.
Double Your Money, which was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire of the 1960s, with a top prize of £1,000, which is a lot, and you double your money.
Yes.
So I believe that you individually stopped Double Your Money going back to Oxford because you won so much money. Is that so? So can you?
Well, what happened was that they came to Oxford to recruit because they decided that the programme was too dull and sober and that they must give it some pizzazz. So they held interviews at the Mitre Hotel, which used to exist, and most of my friends and I got in. But I hit the lucky streak because the person before me failed in the booth, in the golden booth, where you chose to go further. And so it was vacant when I had my turn. And if you went up to about £100, and then you entered this golden pathway. And I went on every week. It was extraordinary. It was mad. I mean, I used to have to go up to London to Rediffusion Studios. My father was very worried about Huey Green's attitude to me. But anyway, but my coup was that I realised that they would make the £1,000, the final £1,000 question very, very, very difficult, because the good television would be to fail at £1,000, and very bad television would be to win £1,000. So I stopped at 500. And with the 500, it was absolutely amazing how far money went in those days.
I was to say,
I mean,
it's a wonderful game theory to stop at £500 because you knew the difficult question. So actually, Diana Quick then said you went off to Paris and came back with a fur coat and some oysters.
that's right.
So that's living large as an undergraduate.
It was a blue rabbit fur coat.
That's very good. You read modern languages here, French
Yes.
and Italian, and then after graduating, went to work in journalism, Daily Telegraph, and then Vogue. I'm imagining that journalism was also a pretty male bastion in the late 60s. I mean, how was that for you, and how did you?
I was quite clear that I wanted to write, but I wanted to finance it in some way because I didn't expect what I wanted to write to make any money. I didn't think I could make a career of that. So I thought journalism, in those days, which was the late 60s, journalism was a very good prop for writing because you could either get, I got an actual job on the Daily Telegraph magazine, which was the first of the colour supplements. Mm-hmm. And it was excellent training because I wrote endless captions and introductions and blurbs, and I learned to write to order very quickly to a certain length. It was a huge, and also it was an amazing training for concentration, because in those days it was an open plan office with typewriters and telephones all ringing all the time, clatter, 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 and I learned to shut it out. Mm-hmm. So I think it was but it was very male, and the editor was everything that you read about in the difficult in difficult ways, and so I actually left, and then I don't know if you saw this I had this revenge on him because I'm afraid it was rather wicked of me, but I entered the prize, the Daily Telegraph competition, under a pseudonym and won it. And then he was very, very mortified. He rang me up to tell me. He said, "Congratulations, Melanie." I said, "No, it's not Melanie."
Good effort. This was the Young Journalist Prize.
Yes,
the Young Journalist of the Year.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yes, so I'm afraid it was rooted in revenge.
It's so interesting what you're saying about training for writing professionally, on the colour supplement, and it's just interesting that Salman Rushdie, who I think was inducted as a Companion of Honour the same day as you, started obviously in advertising before he went in. I think in terms of number of our students and others who are interested in writing as a career, your experience is just really remarkable. I just wanted to, quote Roy Foster, who's from Professor here, that you are a phenomenon of having a successful life as an independent scholar. How did you always want to make a living from writing, and you thought that was your métier?
Yes, it was. I mean, but my father was a bookseller, so I was brought up. I couldn't have been more advantaged. I had absolutely no disadvantages in my background. Every time I showed any interest in anything, he would bring me back books from the bookshop. So I was, in that sense, very, very spoiled. but I always wanted to write. I started writing very young, and I always wanted to write, but I was very aware that it needed, support and income, and I didn't really survive as an independent scholar, not exactly, but I did finance it by journalism, because I gave up and became an academic just before my 60th birthday, because Graham, my husband, said, if you don't apply for a job before you're 60, you'll never get one. So I just snuck in. I went to the University of Essex. It was kind of them to take me in because I wasn't really qualified. So that was because I'd had a period of ill health. Because I'd managed to keep my head above water, but I had a period of ill health, and then I couldn't make enough money.
Because I think I had a quote from another writer, I think Sir Gillian Beer, saying, "You're a very rare." This is in the 2000s. Very rare bird. Freelance writer of considerable powers, not caught up in the academic web. Did you kind of feel when you went to become an academic later in life, you felt that was reduced your freedom to be creative or to write? I think
it reduces a lot of people's freedom. I mean, I think that's, and it's exacerbated by the current. It's probably not as serious in Oxford as it is because the financial struggles are not so great, but in a university like Essex, the emphasis on getting grants and, living just dreadful. It destroys people. Half my colleagues were writing grant proposals instead of writing their books. They're just wasting their substance.
Yep. I just wanted to ask something about when you were a journalist. That you had a famous cover of Maran Faithful on the Colour magazine. Just have a personal connection because Maran Faithful, who was one of the it girls of the 1960s, and her son is an old friend of mine. And how was that? Can you tell me about the Maran Faithful?
I met the son when he was a baby. It's quite funny when I was working on making this cover with her. So what happened? She was an extraordinary person then. In those days, I haven't seen her, for years and years. But she arrived in the restaurant where we first met. And she just dropped her coat. She was just sort of fell to the floor, and then she had only ate an artichoke, and she made the most beautiful flower with all the petals that she ate off the artichoke. She was extraordinary, and she actually showed me the fairy tale illustrators Edmond Dulac and Arthur Rackham, and I'd seen them possibly as a child, but she had a fantastic collection of fairy tale books. And she was really, anyway, I had this idea, because she loved fairy tales so much, that she could personify Morgan Le Fay. She really liked the idea. Peter Blake dressed her for it. So it was quite and it became a poster, which the Daily Telegraph magazine sold. It must be valuable now. Yeah. You don't have an original, do you? No, I don't have one. No. Okay. Anyway, but I was very entranced by her. Yeah. She was very, very, very intelligent and perceptive and sensitive. Yeah. When we were chatting a bit earlier, you said two things I didn't like to talk about, but I'm okay talking about now. One is the Catholic Church, and one is cricket. We'll go maybe move on to cricket in a little bit. But the Catholic Church, one of your most well-known books is Alone of All Her Sex. About the cult of the Virgin Mary, yes, which you wrote in the 70s. Looking back at some of the sort of reappraisals of that from the 2000s, which are looking at where originally it is viewed as stridently feminist, but really is about, you said it's about your private journey in some ways from Catholic upbringing and so on. Can you just talk about the genesis of the book, but also the impact it had and what you thought about the response to it? I know you feel mixed feelings about it being your most well-known, or is it? Because it's such a long time ago. It's nearly 50 years ago. So I sort of feel I've done some other things since. But a lot of people feel that was a sort of milestone. I was brought up entirely to worship the Virgin Mary. There was really almost no presence of God or Jesus, except as a baby in her arms, or a dead man in her arms. And there was a saturation in my school. I went to a convent school, boarding school, a saturation which I actually now find quite productive. I'm very interested in the ideas of how you create community through these rituals, actually. I mean, in fact, I'm working on that in a secular vein, you know, now. So, so when I lost my faith, which for various personal reasons happened, it was a tremendous exile. I really felt very, very cut off from a source of great, you know, both joy and consolation. I haven't gone back to it, which of course many people do, because I'm very disillusioned, not only with the practice of Catholicism in the world, but also, you know, the whole history of what happened under the Catholic banners. But Mary has changed in character a lot. I mean, she's no longer, because of all the scandals, sexual scandals in the church, the kind of imposition of morality on women that they used to use under her name, they can't do it now. And and that has actually changed, and that she's emerged much more as the kind of goddess of the poor, the goddess of mercy, the goddess of the poor. And I'm still very interested in how she, well, at the end of that book, I say, and I haven't changed it, I could have changed it in editions, I say the myth of the myth of the Virgin Mary is over. I mean, I could not have been more wrong. It has grown great. It has grown greater and greater.
Yeah, I mean, your point was that she would sort of retreat into kind of legend like King Arthur or something, rather than have this still very powerful influence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or focal point. I mean, she's the palladium. You know, she's the centre of many, many cities and countries' faith, and their hopes and their dreams.
You have, as you said, done quite a lot since then. So a major theme running through a big chunk of your work is exploring myth and fairy tales, the history, the meaning, the evolution. You mentioned fairy tales when you were talking to Maran Faithful as a journalist. What prompted your interest? What really made that your
Well, I always loved them when I was young, but I felt a little bit ashamed of it, especially in the 60s when a lot of feminist critics attacked them because, you know, they said that they were always all about marriage and social advancement and commercial success, I mean, and beauty. So there was a tremendous and very brilliant barrage, actually, of attacks on conventional fairy tales. People like Anne Sexton in her poems, Transformations, so I kept it to myself. And then I was liberated, really, by Angela Carter's collection to speak about them or to think about them in a different way, because she decided to uncover the latent meaning of fairy tales, and she wrote these wonderful, In the Bloody Chamber and others. She wrote these extraordinary, jewel-like variations. And then I got tremendously interested in the fact that they were women's literature. The transmission seems to have been very strongly associated with women, with grannies and nannies and mothers. But it was so misogynistic in its content. There are so many wicked women. There are so many rivalrous sisters. There's so many murderous mothers even. So I thought, what is going on? Why do women transmit these stories? Why is this a hidden, if you like, concealed form of literature below the radar? Because it's not mostly considered, I mean, it's risen much more now in esteem. But when I started working on it in the 80s, I suppose it was, you know, it was very considered. I remember when I started teaching fairy tales, some of the parents complained. They said, my daughter doesn't go to university to learn fairy tales. Whereas now they've risen in value. But so I started puzzling out these questions, and I wrote a book about it, and about the strains and stresses on families and on society, and how the fairy tales face those things. They face them quite honestly.
And this is From the Beast to the Blonde, and on fairy tales and their tellers in particular.
Yes.
So you're sort of talking about the role of the
tellers.
tellers.
Why do people tell them?
You then also wrote a short history of fairy tales.
Yes, that was the OUP. That's for here. Yes.
The little the book is. We're glad to have we have the I think 2 LMH authors, the Bureau of Fairy Tales, and then David MacDonald on biodiversity. So that's 2 of the fellows who have,
that's very good, yes.
which
But I'm afraid I had an ignoble motive. because I didn't really want to write about fairy tales again. But then I thought, they're going to give the very short introduction to someone else. No, I mean, and then I thought that someone else will be, will have theories about fairy tales which I don't agree with, and then this book will be out there.
That's right. And there can only be one.
So I'm afraid I wanted to stake out my patch in a possessive way.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the more recent work and some of the things you've been doing recently, and some of actually your public lectures, and one on the idea of cross-pollination and the story as a migrating animal or as a seed both through time and through space. Has that grown out of, I guess, the history of fairy tales? But what's your
and also myths. I mean, it's fascinating how the structural shapes return in different countries. And I mean, you do get exceptional bodies of stories. In, say, Iceland, you get some very unique stories, and also Australasia, you get very, very unusual stories which aren't circulating sort of in the world. But otherwise, it's absolutely amazing how a good story pollinates, as you said. I mean, and I think children were quite involved in that, because I think children are quick at languages, and so they remembered stories, and then they could quickly turn them into other languages, and so they would. In their heart, we have no record. We have no record at all of how these stories migrated. Yeah. But obviously, there are centres of place. There are wells, and pilgrim routes, and trade routes, and I'm afraid wars, and also you get exchanges of cultures happening. Yeah.
And one of the examples you give is the Cinderella fairy tale that originated, I think, is it China or Japan, or first known as China?
Yes, it's first written down in the 9th century in China. But the way it's written down, it's clearly known already. The storyteller is not telling it for the first time. The storyteller knows that his audience, I think it's a his in this case, already knows this story. So that's quite interesting. But anyway, it has the shoe, it has the magic godmother figure, who's a fish actually in this story. So it has a similar structure. I mean, there are different theories. My theory, diffusionist theory, is not, there is the archetypal theory that these stories spring hardwired from the brain, from in different regions, different cultures. But I tend to think that there is transmission. You
gave the Wreath Lectures for the BBC back in the 90s, entitled, subtitled 6 Myths for Our Time, and really took 6 concerns facing the UK in the 1990s, and it's kind of interesting to see single mothers being one of the primary social concerns, and issues of masculinity, and sort of link that within myth. And I was curious to ask if you were to give those Wreath Lectures again in 2024 with the same title. What would the concerns facing UK society that you see kind of embedded in or reflective of monsters and myth?
Yes. Well, yes, because the overall title was Managing Monsters.
Managing Monsters.
Yes. No, and I was thinking of that because you kindly prepared me. And I think definitely the myth of the strong man, or the big man, is a definite, huge monster of our time. And why? I mean, they're now spreading, over the globe, and we don't fully understand why. Do they show such competence? So that's one of the why there would be a need to return to this rather ancient idea of the tyrant, the kind of the demagogue who will solve everything. So I would definitely write about that. But I'm afraid the others are probably more controversial in the sense that I'm not very keen on identity politics. I think that there is the myth that you can actually coordinate your identities so carefully, so closely. I think our identities are in flux. They are not entirely linked to the coordinates of our birth, for example. And even coordinates such as class, which are very determined. I don't deny that they're determining. They are indeed determining. But they're also not stable. They also shift. So I think that there's race may be a little bit more determinate because of the way society deals with it. but I don't think that it should be. I mean, I think that again, I believe in much more in the idea of the contingencies that affect a person's life, the possibilities of transformation. This may be one of the few things I keep from my Catholic childhood, and that is that there is a great principle in Catholicism of transformation, of redemption and transformation. So, the idea that people can change over time, that they can actually become different. So I'm not saying that one should deny difference or deny one's original set of circumstances. Not at all. I mean, I think one should definitely own up to them. And if for a writer, of course, they're the primary material. But I don't think that we should, I probably need a whole lecture to, I don't think we should pin our sense of ourselves in the world on these fixed principles. And I think it's led to some great social difficulties.
You mentioned your own life as a source. Going to a more recent work, you have a family memoir. Your father was in the British Army in Egypt, if I'm correct, and your mother is from Italy.
Yes.
And there you have the family memoir, Inventory of a Life Mislaid. Can you tell us about that and whose life mislaid and who's doing the inventory?
Well, actually the Americans changed the title because they said they didn't understand whose life was being mislaid.
Okay, they didn't ask the question.
So, well, in my way of thinking about it is that the life that's mislaid is that life that they had imagined. It was the dream. They imagined, it was a rather conventional fairy tale marriage, between a very poor girl from southern Italy who had no prospects and actually no education, and this sort of well set up English officer, and it was all going to be perfect, and she thought it was going to be perfect, and it wasn't. So the life, and it was meant to be. It's meant to be almost a pun on misled, as well. Yes, and I used objects from their lives. Some of them from Egypt, from their lives, because they went to Egypt after my father liked Egypt so much during the war. They went back to Egypt to live there after, and he opened a bookshop there. And I collected together the objects in the house that came from that period, and tried to kind of crack them open to yield their meanings, or to perhaps to rub their lamps and let genies out. And it was quite a thing to write, actually. It was strange to write the failure of the love affair of your parents.
Yeah. Can we also talk about the current project, your Stories in Transit, which I think is also coming out, a publication regarding that, which is I guess workshops to enable migrants to find their own stories or express get a sense of belonging from their own stories.
Yes.
How did you start that, and what can you describe that? What's the...
Well, I started it because I won a prize, and it was worth quite a lot of money. And it was during the absolute height of the crisis as it began. It's still going on. But, it was 2015 when there were really thousands coming over, and a lot of drownings, a lot of very near drownings, and a lot of... it's still extremely serious. So I wanted to do... And I had friends in the University of Palermo who... and one of them had been interpreting in the courts when the migrants were being sent back, being deported. And she told me how harrowing it was that she had to stand there and interpret, if they were English speakers, she had to interpret what they were saying, why they wanted to stay. And then in one case, the judge said, I'm afraid there are no criteria I can give you sanctuary here. You have to go home. And he fell down on the ground and said, please don't send me home. It's death if you send me home. And she found this so harrowing to translate that she actually gave up doing this court work. But somehow this caught my imagination, and I thought, well, what can we do? What can we do? In a way, this is they've already arrived. The ones we work with have already arrived, and they've stayed. So they're all applying for asylum. They haven't drowned, and they haven't been sent back. They're all in the midst of their processes, which are very laborious and very tiring, very exhausting. And so it's a liminal stage, it's a threshold stage. And I thought, what can we do in that? What can I do as a writer in that threshold stage? I'm not a nurse, I'm not a doctor, I can't feed them. And I thought, well, actually, what we have as a right when we are free is to play and to dream and to write and to think and to simply be together in a kind of pleasurable way. Actually, I saw Mahmoud Darwish, a great Palestinian poet now dead, said in an interview, "I believe in the right to be frivolous." And I only read that yesterday, but actually that could be a mantra for this Stories in Transit. It's the idea that they can play, and we basically not concentrate on their own stories or their own travails, which they can come in. That can come in if they want that to come in. But the first big workshop, we chose the Epic of Gilgamesh, and they picked it up very quickly. I sort of felt maybe they'd heard it before. We had an Arabic storyteller and an Italian and English and French, so it was told in different languages. And briefly, I mean, very just summed up. And then they did the episodes marvelously. They really did marvelously. They made a boat. They made masks. I mean, it was just fantastic. And then we did it in a procession in the botanical garden in Palermo. And because it was a success the first time, Sally's in the front row. She's been. I've been back many times, and each time we try to either collect a story from them to animate, or collect a story from one of them, or we suggest some. Last time, because I didn't have much time with them, we did a story from the Arabian Nights. So, and the idea is that the fundamental principle is that the imagination is liberating and is an organ that needs to be used, and that it isn't actually. It's part of our shutting down the rights of these people that we don't let them do that. We're actually oppressing them by not letting them play. So.
And you're saying there's some
Anyway,
more work coming out of this?
Well, the book is actually on the principle of sanctuary. So it's slightly, the only one chapter towards the end is about stories in transit. The book is about the concept of sanctuary, of how it worked in the past, and how it could possibly be developed and fostered to become a live principle again. Actually, Oxford has got
Sanctuary University.
Yes, and also some colleges have specialised.
Somerville and Mansfield.
Yes. So that's. I mean, the thing is that the sanctuary now has to operate within the strictures of government, so it's not full sanctuary the way it was in the past, but it's still a measure going there. But in the course of my research, which obviously it's taken me years, I pretty much came to the conclusion that we can't make sanctuaries as places. It's very good to have, to have a university of sanctuary or colleges of sanctuary, but what we need to make is a sanctuary in the mind. We need to have a way of thinking about immigration, strangers, hospitality. We need to think about them in different ways. Because this is going to be with us. Climate change is political upheavals. I mean, look what's happening now with Gaza, and even Venezuela now. There are problems in Venezuela. I mean, there will be massive refugees for a long time.
So it must be quite difficult to see, the debate in the UK on migrants and asylum is so far away from sanctuary of thought or the mind. It's very, it's.
But it's also extraordinary. I mean, in the roundup at the end of last year, someone printed Suella Braverman's maiden speech in the House of Commons, in which she begins saying, she begins by saying, a man came from Kenya with no papers, with nothing, and he arrived in this country, and that man was my father. Then she says, and a woman came from, Mauritius, and she had nothing, she had no papers, and that was my mother. What's happened to her? What's happened to her? It's absolutely extraordinary.
Well, I really recommend people looking at Stories in Transit as a remarkable project, and looking forward to that book coming out. I wonder if you had, as you can see, a long career making a living from writing, which I know is a number of fellows and students would aspire to. Any advice that you would have for our students looking to forge a career as an author, as a
Well,
writer?
I think that actually now with the web, it's good. I mean, there are lots of outlets. How you get paid is another matter.
That was really what I was
Yes. So,
alluding to.
I mean, it may be that we need to go back to the, well, of course, a lot of young people have done this. They've gone back to having odd jobs, and then they're financing their art or their writing through these odd jobs. I think it has become harder, in spite of the outlets, because the mainstream press, for writing, for the actual profession of writing, the mainstream press does not any longer commission long articles from younger people. I mean, it may do from very famous writers, but it doesn't allow. Whereas the colour supplements were a huge employment, and the BBC used to employ a lot of writers. So, I mean, the outlets have shrunken, I'm afraid. And there used to be a lot of magazines, too, that paid. No, it's difficult. I'm afraid, I think we might have to go back to the old way, which is that you become a bank clerk, and then you write poems all through the night.
Amongst other achievements, you were the first female president of the Royal Society of Literature. What was that like?
Well, shame on them, for one thing, if I was the first. In a profession where women have really distinguished themselves, especially in this country. 1823 was the foundation year. It took a long...
It's pretty outrageous, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely outrageous, yes.
Yeah. What does that role entail? I mean, what's
Well, it entails, in the view of the people who run it, less than I would have wanted. I couldn't exercise any influence at all. They really wanted a figurehead.
Okay. What is the role?
A silent figurehead.
What's the? Oh, because that. What would you have liked to have done in that role?
Well, one thing that we clashed about was that they maintained that they couldn't take any political stand on anything, whereas I thought that because you couldn't speak for so many writers, but I said that we should make statements about things like writers' freedom. So when Salman Rushdie was attacked, for example, I wanted them to put a statement on the website saying, we deplore this attack and we uphold the right of writers to write. And actually here, we couldn't, and I wanted to hold an event to show solidarity with him. But they refused. So we actually held it here. And it was a great success at the Bodleian Library. And lots of students came, students from every kind of, diversity. And many of them read. So it wasn't as if there was going to be a sort of major, offence given to support Rushdie. And it wasn't really supporting Rushdie's views. It was supporting the idea that someone has a right to their views. So that was the kind of clash I had with them.
Okay. Now, I'm very curious about being a companion of honour. I know there are only 65 of them in the country, and there's, there must be good parties and there must be good events, but there's not. I'd have to say, just an LMH plug, I think one of the few colleges have 2 companions of honour, Antonia Fraser being the other.
That's good.
So,
yes.
what does that entail? It must be
nothing so far, except I was invested at Windsor Castle by Prince William, but. Otherwise, no invitations to parties have come my way.
Neither funeral nor coronation, or did you get to go?
No, I got to go to the coronation. I'm sorry, the funeral. Sorry. Yes, that's right. But that was
that's not much of a party, but you get the funeral, but not the coronation.
Although we got a lot of there was a nice. There was a lot of waiting around, and there was very nice company. Okay. So I did have a nice time. In spite of this occasion.
I wanted to. Last question. Come back to cricket. So I know you don't want to talk about cricket, and I just, for those who don't know, the Warner stand at Lord's is named after Marina. Well, not actually, but named after Marina's grandfather, yes. Plum Warner. Why did you not want to talk about cricket? Was it a dominant factor when you were growing up, or?
It actually sort of slightly ruined my father's life because he wasn't good at it. And his father never forgave him. His father was a complete monomaniac. I mean, he wrote 21 books on cricket, which I think is where I get my graphomania. But he thought of nothing else, nothing at all. I mean, because after he stopped being an actual player, he founded the Cricketer magazine and edited it, and he also managed the England team. Mm-hmm. So he was, and he was president of the MCC. I mean, his whole life was cricket. And in those days, cricket was very much the life of the country. He was an adored figure, absolutely adored.
Did he win some Ashes at some point?
Yes, he did, yes.
Yeah, so that was...
yes, he won some Ashes. We used to have cartoons of him winning Ashes all over the house. But my father suffered for his failure at cricket. He was short-sighted. He had stubbed his toe very badly when he was a child and couldn't really run enough. All these wicked things were done to him to humiliate him. And so I wasn't very happy about cricket. But then also, it was an obsessive conversation, like tonight, obsessive conversation topic. And when I first was a fellow at All Souls, the first person who didn't talk to me about cricket was the man I married.
Great. Well, that's a good dating tip. And I just want to close, if I may, by it's great to have Graham here. But back from 1964, Marina, you did actually say, brains or talent are her requirements in the suitor. So we have brains and talent. And but she has been dated during term by the Maharaja of Gwalior.
Oh, yes.
He has 3 palaces, 50 cars, and a £4 million collection of jewels back in India. Is that true?
This is another of these scurrilous cuttings you have. Well, I remember him very well. He had an E-type Jaguar, which he took me out in. But he got into terrible trouble because of this newspaper article. And because his mother back in Gwalior was, he was meant to he was fiancéed to somebody there. It caused, yes, it's absolutely shameful. Anyway, he never would speak to me again because it was this.
But 50 cars, that was a good, that's good. Marina, thank you so much for the conversation, for coming back.